everyone, and welcome. Today I am tackling the question, how much clothing did they actually have back then? Well, the answer, as you might realize, is incredibly complex. No different than today. I don't even know how many socks I own, let alone an average person. So this is a very difficult question to give an exact number to, because we've also changed a lot as to what's in our wardrobe. But I don't think we're really looking for exact numbers, though I promise I will give some. Instead, I think we're looking for either a confirmation or denial of the story that we've been told that back in the day, they only had a few working garments and one nice outfit to wear to church, and that was it. And isn't it great how much more stuff, how much more clothing we have now? Look how much better off we are. And that is definitely a story that I've heard a lot, but not surprisingly, it's more complicated than that. There is a complete shift in our relationship with clothing from the 17th and 18th centuries up to the modern day. We have completely changed how we make clothing, how we buy clothing, how we wear clothing, how we launder our clothing. Everything about it has changed so dramatically. So it's not as simple as just knowing what number of things we have in our closet to help us understand how that has changed. But there are still some documents we can look towards that really help give us a better idea. Anything from inventories to government surveys, to budgets for newlyweds, to fashion magazines telling people what to take to college. There's a whole host of information that we can look towards that can start to assemble a really clear picture for us. But as always, there's going to be variety within that. One of the most interesting things that I came across in doing this research was from 1871, and it's a series of 2 articles. The first one, which is called Elinor's Wardrobe, talks about young woman Elinor who takes all of her clothing allowance and spends it on a few really expensive pieces. So she'll only have one essentially going out dress for the entirety of winter. She'll have a different one or two for summer, but she only has that one, and she keeps it for a couple of years before she manages to buy another one with her entire allotted allowance for the season. She only buys very high quality, very few items. And the entire article is about how great this is in comparison to her friend Ann Eliza, who takes that money and buys lots of less expensive, very trendy things. So she will have a lot more, but those things are cheaper and they look cheaper and they're going to wear out faster and they're going to go out of style faster. She's going to get sick of them, but they're spending the same amount of money on their clothing. They just appear a little bit differently to the eye. And supposedly, we're supposed to realize how great Elinor is, how we're essentially, in modern terms, supposed to not go with fast fashion, but look for the most restricted of capsule wardrobe ideas possible. So we're still hearing this story today, and it's fascinating that we can go all the way back to 1871, and nothing has changed there. But the most interesting part of this is the second article, which is a response to this one. And it basically says this whole thing is really stupid. That everyone can exist on this spectrum anywhere in between these two, and that the reality is it's not practical to buy a whole bunch of cheap things that will fall apart and you'll get sick of, nor is it practical to only buy one thing, because what happens if it gets a little bit dirty and needs to go off to the cleaners? This just isn't a practical choice. So most people exist somewhere in between these two, depending on their interests in fashion and what they need and their budgets and so much more. So we have to keep that in mind the whole way through this, that this is one example out of many, and there should be a range on either side of any numbers that we're seeing. But starting off by heading back a little bit further so we can get a better understanding of our relationship with clothing and how it's changed over the centuries, in the 18th century, we can find numbers in the form of inventories. So when someone passes away, an inventory of all of their goods of worth is taken. So that automatically means a lot of stuff isn't accounted for. Anything that isn't worth a good amount of money, if it's sold, is not going to be counted because it's not going to actually be of value to whoever is inheriting this estate. So you're going to find a limited number of goods within these inventories. Great example of this, which was well analyzed by Rebecca Starkins, who's a trades historian at Colonial Williamsburg, takes a look at one of the inventories that they have online, which they have many different ones, so you can access a lot of different examples of this. And we specifically know that Mary Cooley, who passed away in 1778, was a midwife. It's really important to know who you're looking at, how wealthy they were, and what sort of job they had, what sort of life they lived. So we can look at her inventory and we can see 10 gowns, 6 petticoats, 9 shifts, and a whole lot of other different major items of clothing and furniture and so much more. But the thing is, she was a working midwife, and all of those 10 gowns mentioned, as Rebecca notes, are all on the more expensive side. They're fancier clothing items. None of her working clothes are mentioned. So these numbers are really difficult to get a precise reading on because they leave out so much. We can just know that they have at least this much. Already, we're starting to see evidence that maybe it wasn't just one nice gown. Obviously, we would need a lot more examples of this, but it's important to note that back as of the 18th century and well into the 19th century, really until the very end of it, the relationship that we had with clothing and the way it was made and the way that we acquired it was a bit different than what we're used to today. So clothing was generally made up custom by professionals in the time period. There are examples of homemade things, but they tend to be very simple garments, very unfitted things. There are some mass-produced items, things like shirts and shifts, caps and kerchiefs, things that don't have to be fitted or only need a few very generic sizes. And that's because the actual skill of draping, cutting, patterning, fitting, all of those things is something you have to go through training for. There aren't sewing patterns, there aren't instructions. While yes, people did know how to sew, knowing how to stitch is different than knowing how to create an entire suit that fits. And most people were too busy doing their own jobs. It makes sense to have a professional do it because it's not the making up that's expensive, it's the fabric. That's where the value comes in, and that's why this is so important to think about it differently, because in a lot of these inventories, it's the fabric that is of value, and you'll actually find yardage of fabric in a lot of people's inventories as well, where they went out, purchased fabric, and planned to have it made up into a suit or a gown later, just hadn't gotten around to it, or perhaps it's a very old suit or gown that they've actually had for decades. They certainly wouldn't wear it now, but the fabric was very expensive at the time, and they're not going to get rid of it. And eventually down the road, they planned on remaking it when that style or color came back in. And we do find a lot of things got remade in the 19th century out of 18th century fabric. That's one of the reasons why so little actually survived from that century. And so the fabric was what kept getting remade over and over again. So they weren't necessarily having to buy a whole new gown or suit every single season. They could have some things remade, retrimmed, reworked, new accessories, and it'd be a whole new outfit. So many people were very smart and economical about their wardrobe choices because though clothing was expensive, it was the fabric that was expensive, and that could be changed without much money. Now this starts to shift pretty rapidly in the 19th century with all the industrialization, with sewing machines, as well as things like sewing patterns that come out in the late 19th century and become more popular. More people are making things in the home. Fabric is becoming cheaper because of the industrial process. So essentially, until we reach that late 19th century point where we start seeing a lot of sewing patterns and instructions, most people just don't have the knowledge or the time to be able to produce their own clothing. One great example of this that I came across was from 1883, where a woman was going through what she considered a very narrow budget for clothing, and she mentions that she makes some of her clothing in order to save money. But she also specifies that in making a dress, she goes to the local dressmaker that she works with regularly, has the dressmaker make up a pattern and do the fittings for her, and she pays her 75 cents for that work. The sewing is what she does back at home. So she's not attempting to figure out how to do the skilled labor of patterning and fitting and all of that. That's a professional's job. So while clothing might be getting less expensive and therefore seemingly more accessible, remember that the people making the clothing, just like the people making anything else during the Industrial Revolution, are getting paid less and less because they need less and less what they consider skill in order to do these jobs. While the cost of clothing is going down, the pay is also going down. Of course, creates a much more complex situation. And therefore, entering into the fray of this is the ready-to-wear industry. Whereas before, getting something made up custom was the norm, now it's becoming more common, if you aren't very wealthy, to go out to department stores or buy out of catalogs things that are already pre-made. They're done up in sizes. You might have some alterations made to it to fit you better in the end, but a lot of these things are much simpler, much plainer. They are still fashionable and they can still be fairly expensive, but they are more available to this broad audience of no matter where you are, you can get a catalog from these large department stores and have clothing mailed to you. So catalogs like Montgomery Ward, which started up in the 1880s with clothing, and Sears, which started up in the 1890s with clothing, really change our relationship with clothing very quickly. And the way that it's made is dramatically shifting as well, because it's no longer local shops, it's not even large industrial facilities working to supply the company that they work for with clothing. By the late 19th century, it's much more common to work with what they call jobbers, which is a separate facility that does all of the construction for multiple companies. And it turns out, as you can move that further and further away from the city sources of the department centers, the wages of those people go down, and eventually they move that into other countries in order to have lower wages, and that is what, in many ways, has led to cheaper clothing today. There's a dramatic shift in the way that we purchase our clothing, really picking up in the latter part of the 19th century, and it continues changing throughout the next. And we can see the changes in this industry reflected in things like household budgets. There are an incredible number of studies done, especially in the 20th century, on what household budgets look like, how to deal with very specific incomes for different families, whether they're in the country or the city, whether they're working class or middle class or upper class. There are so many different studies on this. Many of these studies, particularly the ones that I'm going to be looking at today, are talking about what they consider minimum comfort, and they're usually in reference to families of 4 or 5, so 2 or 3 kids. And minimum comfort is the same as our standard of living concept, that it means this is the point where enough money is being made that they can get what they need, as well as some of the very basic nice things in life. So they'll break this down and you'll see obvious stuff like housing and food on here, but you're also going to see things like furniture or basic home conveniences like a less expensive car or a vacuum cleaner, electric lighting, a fridge, washing machine. The basic things that are considered absolutely essential for our function today, but in this era that we're talking about, particularly the 1920s and earlier, those still aren't in every home. They're still fairly expensive, and it is considered a minimum comfort to have access and be able to purchase those sorts of things. So minimum comfort is not bare minimum scraping by, it is someone actually subsisting pretty well, including things like entertainment. For example, a radio as part of that. Above that level, we have the comfort level, which usually means all of those things, a little bit easier spending on more entertainment and more amusements. They also have 7 to 10% they can put aside for savings and not have any issues. So looking at this wide range of different budgets that I found, it is universal across all of them that the first category that you spend the most on is food, the next is housing, and after that it is clothing. It's the standard for everything I found from the 1850s through the 1970s. What comes below that groups differently for different eras depending on what's needed. Some of them will put in very specific items like a whole section just for tobacco or liquor. Others will have much broader things of entertainment and insurance and other basic household supplies or things like that. But even though they split this up in different ways, it is notable that they never split it up in terms of wants and needs, which is a really typical way for us to split up budgets today, where it's what bills do you have to pay, and then the rest goes into the wants category, of which clothing usually is considered part of that, despite the fact that we have to have clothing in order to do our jobs and function in the world. But they consider clothing part of the wants category. That's not the way that they view not only clothing, but anything in these earlier budgets. They understand that even things like entertainment fall under useful mental and physical health. So looking at this range that I have, which is from 1875 to 1967, in terms of just clothing budgets. Though they are from a variety of different sources in terms of who these budgets are for, the vast majority are meant for minimum comfort families, as I mentioned before, of usually 4 or 5. Even then, when you see the broader scope of things, there's not a huge difference between a single, a couple, a family in terms of percentages. They just spend less per person in order to keep up the same percentage. You also won't see major differences between rural and city areas. Yes, city areas do spend a little bit more, maybe a couple percentage points on average more than rural areas do on clothing, but it's not a huge difference. I also found that it stayed fairly stable regardless of income. Essentially, once you reach that minimum comfort point, it stays pretty stable in percentage until we reach the comfort level in which the percentage drops down a little bit to start with, but keeps rising along with rising expectations of how much clothing they need in order to perform their job and their functions within society. So as you get wealthier, you need more clothing to keep up with that, and clothing gets more expensive. So in general, these percentages don't change dramatically until we get to very far on either end of the scale. So I put these into a scatter chart because I think it makes the most sense. And you'll generally see it starts off a little bit above 15% earlier on, and it sort of generally goes down to just a little below 15%. So anywhere from 10 to 20% for the vast majority of these recommendations. 15 is kind of that central point. There's a little bit of a weird blip with that section in the 1920s because there's massive inflation that occurs during World War I, and so the cost of clothing and how to manage it and the amount that people were getting paid were going all over the place. So there are some changes that occur in that time period, just trying to manage the massive inflation and deflation that was occurring from year to year. So that's why it's a little bit mixed up there. But in general, the overall line is very gently sloping down, passing the 15 mark and heading downwards. We can compare this to today, where budgets, which are usually particularly aimed at the broad middle class, people that need to have a budget, but also have enough money that they can come up with a budget and decide where some of that money is going, recommends for a lot of them around 5% of your household income post-taxes is spent on clothing. Now this is very important because most of those earlier numbers that I look at include taxes as one of the chunks. It's usually between 1 to 4% for the vast majority of these, until we reach the 1960s when it rises to 13 to 18% for this minimum comfort level. And those are included as a part of that pie chart versus taken out first and then figuring the math. So that 5% is actually lower if we included taxes, which is much higher than 1 to 4% for most people. So this is already a little bit skewed in favor of making that number look bigger than it actually is. And even that is a recommended level. That's not the actual spending. So on average, most American households will spend $1,500 a year on clothing, which is a lot less than 5% when you realize that our median household income is $75,000. It would be 5% for something more like $30,000 post-taxes. So we spend a lot less today on clothing than we did in the past. But supposedly we also have a lot more clothing, right? So how is that working? Well, that's where we need to move over to clothing prices. And this is where it gets really complicated because inflation really messes with numbers a lot. It goes up and down. It is not consistent. Yes, there are such things as inflation calculators, but they don't actually give you a useful number. I'm going to be honest with you. It might be a little bit fun to plug things in and get an idea of it, but at best it is to show buying power. If you earned that money, it's a dramatically different calculation. A great example of this is that we're looking at median incomes. Very early on in my chart, we're looking at median incomes in the late 19th century around 750. By the time we reach 1919, post-World War I and the massive inflation that happens there, we're expecting more of an income median around 1,000. It will continue to go up over the next few decades, so it might be more like 2,000 to 3,000 during the 1950s. By the time we reach the late 1960s and into the 70s, it's going to be more like 5,000 and upwards from there. So inflation does keep bringing that number up, but if we put that 1,000 from 1918 into an inflation calculator for that median income, it comes out at a value of around 22.4 thousand, which is, again, nowhere near our 75,000 median household income. So things are not really easy to calculate because we actually don't have a really rock solid way of calculating inflation in a broad sense. For specific items, yes, but specific items like a pound of flour or a gallon of milk also have their own fluctuations within these charts as well, where suddenly there might be a shortage and the price can go up massively, so we can no longer use that to track overall inflation for everything else. So there's a lot of complication in actually mathematically coming up with what this is. So I am not going to be putting all of these numbers into inflation calculators and changing it to be in quote modern numbers, because honestly, that's not how this works. Instead, what I did was I went through a whole bunch of Sears catalogs from the late 1890s through to 1960. I tried to do it roughly every 5 to 10 years in order to get enough points on major items. I kind of went through and averaged things out. So I went through, say, all of their winter coats for women and kind of looked at where the median common price was for each one of these things. This is not going to be a really precise way of looking at it, but it's going to give us a pretty good idea. So I mapped out these major clothing items, separating out things like winter and summer suits and dresses because the type of fabric and the amount of layers and effort that goes into it can dramatically change. They separate those out in terms of cost. There's a pretty big difference and I didn't want to muddle them up together. And the charts that I get out of this are really fascinating in the fact that we can actually lay the food inflation charts on top of this and it is very much the same. So clothing prices aren't doing dramatically different things than the entirety of the grocery store, which is a pretty broad range of things we're purchasing. I did find it interesting that the menswear section didn't have as much of a bump up and then back down again in the post-World War I section of inflation as the women's wear did. But there's a whole complication there with demand for men's clothing within wartime efforts when a huge chunk of men are not currently purchasing clothing because they're over fighting a war in Europe. So things are complex within that for many different reasons. And we don't see as much of a weird bump with World War II because there were a lot of price regulations occurring during that time. So they attempted to keep that from happening again. But we can see the general rising prices as we head off the screen into the 1970s. So it's interesting in the fact that these follow the trends in general and aren't going substantially downwards, meaning that we aren't seeing clothing get a lot more expensive or clothing get a lot cheaper in comparison to other things, in comparison to food, in comparison to income levels, general inflation, and everything else. This is following the same basic chart that everything else is. So that means our budget for clothing isn't dramatically changing through that time, it's gradually going down a little bit, and the price of clothing isn't dramatically changing during that time, it's also going down a little bit. So while clothing is certainly getting more expensive, it's not rising at quite the same rate as general inflation, but it's very close. So at least up until the 1970s, it's not that we're seeing a dramatic shift in the price of clothing that completely changes how much clothing we're able to purchase. So I'm curious now to see if the number of garments recommended within these wardrobes does shift within that period, and suddenly we're recommended much more clothing than we used to have, and that might be able to make up that slight difference in price that we see, which is, again, not shockingly, a complex concept, because the sort of clothing that we needed to put together one outfit 100 years ago or 200 years ago is dramatically different than today. So really briefly, looking at a sort of exploded view of, say, an 1890s woman's outfit and a 1930s woman's outfit, you're going to see a lot of pieces. And there's reasons for all these pieces. These aren't just superfluous, you need to buy more things because fluffy, frilly, fun fashion. The undergarment section, this entire range in both of these, is meant for launderable things. Things that go up against the skin will absorb all of your sweat and oils, and that's what gets washed so your outer clothing doesn't have to. The next layer up is that of support. This is where things like corsets and petticoats and brassieres come into play. Things that support the back, the bust, support the shape of the garment, make it comfortable to wear, and from there they start adding in these outer layers which are much closer and more familiar to what we're used to today. We just don't have the inner layers because, again, our outer layers exist on their own and we're expected to form that shape ourselves out of muscle and fat instead of out of control garments and ruffles and fluff and things like that. And we also don't have that cleanliness layer to then launder because all of our clothing has become washable. That was really the thing that started to happen more so in the 19-teens and 20s than anywhere else. Everything started being color fast, washable, and there's a dramatic shift in the way that we treat our wardrobe during that time, and that's where we start to see the shift away from quite as many layers because the outer layers can now be laundered too. For menswear, there's not as much of a change between those different decades. There's definitely a difference between today and 100 years ago, however. So in the case of menswear, they still also have the same major categories of the cleanliness layer that is meant to absorb all the sweat and oils, of the basic support layers that keep everything in place, whether it's sock garters and suspenders and belts. But for menswear, most of that shaping and body alteration occurs with the external layer, the coats, waistcoats and the like, where those actually get padded up and built out. Think shoulder pads. That external layer and then all the accessories that come with it is what we are used to seeing. There's just all the under layers to help support it, keep it clean, and keep it functional for longer. So these lists of what is recommended can be fairly extensive for that reason, because you need all of those different garments in order to have a functional outfit, not just one that looks good, but one that actually functions. So I found a number of examples starting in 1883 for the women's garments. I didn't find as many for the men's garments, but I do still have a few. So for the women's, we're starting in 1883 with this story from a woman who is supposedly a poor clergyman's daughter, one of 7 daughters, which is a lot, and she states that she gets a budget of $71 a year to spend on her clothing, and that all of her sisters get the same, which adds up to around $500 a year, which As you might recall from me earlier saying, around this time, something more like 750 was more that minimum comfort level of household income. So I highly doubt that they are only at that minimum comfort level making $750 a year. I have a feeling it's quite a bit more than that. So poor might really not be the right term for this. But regardless, 71 is a pretty reasonable range of money spent on clothing for an annual amount. It's not absurdly wealthy by any means, but it's not on the lower end. The 1908 comes from Harper's Bazaar, where it's meant to be a budget of $100 a year. 1919, which is both women's and men's, is from Standards of Living, which is meant to be looking at that minimum comfort, looking at the cost of living, much more a survey-based budget of what is the minimum that the family needs to purchase in order to be functional. There's also this additional 1925 for the men, which is from a fashionable actor, which I just found amusing. It kind of skews numbers a little bit if we look at it that way, but it's interesting to see a variation on this. And then for 1944 and 1947, they are also back towards that minimum comfort idea. They are meant for working people, for both working men and working women, and what they need in order to be able to function. None of these have workwear mentioned in them. I do find that interesting. So things like overalls, coveralls, that sort of stuff, not listed in this. This is very much an everyday range of clothing that is needed in order to function in society. When you look at these numbers, you'll see there is a little bit of growth as we move forward. I tried to find things that were like to like, so things like chemises, which go underneath the corsets, kind of gradually turn themselves into slips because they're very similar garments. There's not always a one-for-one with all of these, but you'll notice the numbers aren't dramatically different as we go from earlier to later. So a lot of these things only mention one or two that you'll need. Things like overcoats, winter coats, that makes sense. Things like summer dresses and winter dresses, that's where you do see a higher number, sometimes as high as 4 for each one of those, which doesn't include house dresses, which are the more casual styles. The only place that mentions formal wear is, interestingly enough, the Poor Clergyman's Daughter, who mentions purchasing 2 formal silk gowns a year. And things like sweaters and sportswear do go up in numbers because that starts being a normal part of our wardrobe as we reach the 1920s and 30s. So there are changes within this, and some of these numbers are added upwards, but it's not a dramatic shift. But when you look at this is a fair amount of clothing they're talking about is much more bare minimum. The 1908 one from Harper's Bazaar does actually break it down far better, because not only is it giving a full list of things it thinks you actually need, but it's talking about how often they need to be purchased. So some things like socks and underwear are purchased every single year. You need to constantly get new ones. However, things like winter coats or corsets or whatnot are more 2, 3, or 4 years apart in purchases. Now, it does not specify in these, however, how much you might have left over. A lot of these lists are aimed at how much you need to purchase on that 1, 2, 3, 4 year range, not how long these things can last. Because yeah, occasionally some things, like a heavier winter coat, might last longer than the 4 years that you need it if you have more than one. A great way to see how this view can change things are these 2 lists of what girls going off to college for the first time need to have in their wardrobe. This 1937 one is intended for what you need to purchase and then supplement with things you already have. The 1944 one is looking at what you need to bring with you, regardless of whether you need to go out and purchase it or you just already have it. And the numbers are dramatically different for being such a short distance apart from each other. These are pretty comparable. It just changes from, yes, you need to go purchase 1, 2, 3 dresses to you should bring 6 dresses. You need to go out and purchase a couple of sweaters in your school colors to you should bring 8 to 10 sweaters. So there's a dramatic difference in the numbers that we see when it's talking about how much you need to purchase versus how much you should have available to you in your wardrobe. So all those other numbers are much more about what you need to purchase. So what you actually have might be larger, because just like in the 18th century where they were taking the fabric and remaking and reusing, they continued to do that well into the middle of the 20th century. And by the time we stop altering our clothing in terms of taking it apart and changing it stitching wise, raising the hem, changing the trim, things like that, we've moved into a lot of separates. By the 1930s, separates are all the rage, and mixing and matching your outfits together when they coordinate very much in that same capsule wardrobe range is a very popular thing and very good way to dress fashionably on a budget, because suddenly a suit and a dress is not just 2 outfits, it's 3, 4, 5 outfits depending on how you work those accessories and how you match things up. So the wardrobe quantity isn't dramatically increasing just yet. If anything, the clothing itself is getting simpler. It's also turning towards synthetic fabrics, so it's being produced cheaper. It is, yes, more likely to wear out faster in a lot of these cases, purely because we're dealing with that outerwear that is now meant to be laundered. It's no longer sturdy, structured, full of different layers and infrastructure which keep it going for longer, and little bits can be changed out. Now it is just a very plain, simple, singular garment, and there's not a lot you can do to change that aside from accessories. So as we're losing the layers, we're expecting the clothing we do have to keep doing more. But if we don't need all of those layers underneath, we're now purchasing more clothing. That's for the exterior. So all this to say is that clothing wasn't absurdly expensive back then, and now it's so cheap we can afford so much of it. What has essentially happened is that we wear very different clothing, and though our numbers might be pretty similar in terms of the amount of clothing items in our closet, we have a lot more external clothing, and it's a lot simpler external clothing. So if we say track the price of something like a winter coat even further past that 1960, 1970 point, it's not cheaper today for a good wool winter coat like you could have purchased at any point in the last couple hundred years. But instead, our wardrobe is made up of really basic, cheap clothing that wears out really fast. We launder everything that we have, and it has a lot of elastic in it, which stretches out pretty quickly. It's just not going to last as long, but we make it much simpler out of cheaper fabrics and then buy more of it. Much like Ann Eliza in that earlier 19th century story, that's the way that we tend to function in comparison to the past, where they would have a lot of undergarments that you would never see, and those got used up and worn out and replaced in multitude every single year, but they might not buy as many suits. But how often today do we buy a suit? And in reality, if you look at the comparatives of buying a suit out of essentially a catalog, a modern day sort of catalog, if you think about it in terms of your overall clothing budget, the amount that you would have to spend on the suit is a lot more than they would have spent on a suit. So those things that they used to wear haven't really changed. Instead, we're just essentially wearing underwear as outerwear all of the time. So yes, it might feel like our closet has more because we have more interchangeable outfits, but the reality is our number of total outfits in our wardrobe isn't that much higher. It's just changed up a lot as to how much we're wearing at the same time and how long those things last us. Therefore, there is not one simple answer as to how much clothing they had back then, nor clearly is there a simple answer of how our relationship with clothing has changed over the last few centuries. So to answer the big question of how much clothing did they actually have back then, the answer is a lot more than you would think. And interestingly enough, clothing used to be considered much more important to them in terms of how it's made, how it's worn, how it's used up, how it continues its lifespan than it is to us today.